Welcome to another video. In our last video, we covered how to estimate factor models. And while we typically use maximum likelihood, there are other methods out there for estimating them. In today's video, I wanted to cover a little more detail about some famous papers that put factor models on the map in terms of how to utilize them for superior econometric analysis. And these papers are written by Jim Heckman, Nobel Laureate, and also some of his graduate students and other collaborators. So I hope that going through these papers will give you an appreciation for the pioneering work that was done and give you a sense of where you could go from here. We'll start by covering this 2006 Journal of Labor Economics paper. And this paper was basically wanting to bring in the psychometrics literature into labor economics to show that these cognitive and non-cognitive abilities that we've been discussing throughout this mini-series actually do correlate with real things in the real world. So they have two factors in their model, which they call F super C and F super N, meaning cognitive and non-cognitive. And they have a bunch of outcomes in their model. And for each outcome, they're going to have some X's, and they're going to have some of these factor loadings alpha and the two factors, and then some error term like you would normally have in a regression model. And basically, they're allowing these factor loadings to vary by the amount of schooling a person received. And they're also assuming that these factors explain all the dependence among these different outcomes that they're looking at. So this is just standard factor model assumptions, although they are being a little bit more specific about having separate loadings for separate levels of schooling. So their model is going to cover a lot of different outcomes. It's going to cover a lot of labor market outcomes like wages and employment and occupation and work experience. They're also going to cover schooling choice and risky behaviors such as smoking or drugs or crime or pregnancy. And then to provide some economic interpretation, so that the model up to now is just a statistical model. But then to try to provide some economic interpretation, they also have a life cycle model where they're saying that individuals are maximizing the expected present discounted value of utility over consumption and labor supply according to some parameters eta. And then because there's an integral here, we note that this is a continuous time model as opposed to discrete time. And that's where this exp of negative rho t is coming in. So this is the discount factor in a continuous time model. And then there's some law of motion for human capital. There's wages that they receive if they supply labor. And then there's some budget constraint. So we don't need to get into these in too much detail. This is just sort of the economic lens through which they're going to view their statistical model results. But they're not actually going to estimate the parameters of this structural model. They just sort of have it going on in the background. So why is the economic model useful? Well, basically, it's useful for interpretation. The statistical model is just these linear approximations. So we need to understand how those statistical parameters map into economic fundamentals. Along with economic fundamentals is what we would call micro foundations, which is just saying, what are these factors that we're recovering? Well, maybe they're the product of a whole childhood worth of investment on the parent's part. That would be a micro foundation. They're also showing mechanisms. So are these operating in terms of preferences or productivity? We need an economic model to appreciate that. And then for policy relevance, they could simulate the effects of some intervention on the primitives of the model. They don't actually do that in this paper, but they're sort of laying the groundwork for how to do that. And then in later papers, they end up indeed doing that. How are these things identified? Well, basically, they are imposing a bunch of exclusion restrictions in how the factors are measured and then how the factors are affecting certain outcomes. And so the idea is that with sufficient variation in the right places of the model, then I can separate these two factors from other unobservable effects on the outcomes. And you can consult the paper. There's a big table, I think it's table 2, that has a bunch of like the exhaustive list of all the exclusion restrictions that they're imposing. And then how do they estimate this? Well, they're actually going to use Markov chain Monte Carlo to sample from the posterior likelihood and then get the model estimates that way, like we talked about in a prior video. And then they do some simulations where they're drawing values of these factors based on the estimated distributions. And then they're plotting what's the conditional expectation of various outcomes given the factors. So there's no counterfactuals happening here. They're just basically showing that these factors do indeed affect multiple outcomes in the way that their theory is proposing. And indeed, they find evidence that confirms their model. If they didn't, then this paper would not have been published and it would not have been cited as much as it has been, which is actually a lot of citations for a paper in the Journal of Labor Economics. So I just checked, and it's been cited 6,400 times, which is just mind-boggling for a paper in Journal of Labor Economics. Let's go on to another related paper, and this is by a different co-author with Jim Heckman, and this is appearing in the 2007 AEA Papers and Proceedings issue of the American Economic Review. And basically, in this paper, they're just positing that these factors that they were picking up in young adulthood in the other paper are actually the product of some dynamic process in childhood. So parents invest time in kids. Those kids develop these skills over time. So the factor in the next period is a function of the initial period factor and the initial period investment. So there's a dynamic process. And because there's this dynamic process, there's going to be a complementarity between making investments early and making investments later. So in particular, it's not the case that these investments are substitutable. And then because of this dynamic process, it's going to be really important to intervene early so that if you can close the gap early, then that can have a large payoff in the future. And so the policy implication, which Heckman has built a lot of his career on, is that there isn't an equity efficiency trade-off for making these childhood investments. So that's that paper. And then we have a seminal paper in Econometrica in 2010 that looks at how to actually structurally estimate this model that they posited in the 2007 Papers and Proceedings. And we've got Cunha and Heckman again, and then they've added Suzanne Schenak, who was at the time a professor at the University of Chicago, one of Heckman's colleagues, and she has a lot of research on measurement systems and so forth. So here, in this paper, the main contribution is that they're showing how to non-parametrically identify and estimate this production technology that they posited in the 2007 paper. So they're actually getting elasticity of substitution between the factor and the investment. They're accounting for endogeneity of parental investments, and they're anchoring the test scores so that there's not these arbitrary scaling issues. And their main finding is that the substitutability decreases for cognitive skills later in the life cycle, which just means that we should intervene early. But for non-cognitive skills, it's more constant. And so the implication is that cognitive skills, we need to attack these gaps in cognitive skills among different kids early on in their life. But non-cognitive skills, we could sort of catch up later if we need to. So that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the seminal papers that put these factor models on the map. And in our final video of this mini-series coming up next, we'll cover what some papers published a decade after these original ones have innovated on and how these factor models are being used on the frontier of knowledge. Thanks for joining this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.